A few months back, a far more successful YouTuber who goes by Sean released a video titled How PragerU Lies to You, where he put forward the radical, shocking idea that Prager University isn't actually a university, but is instead a YouTube channel funded by fossil fuel billionaires with the aim of promoting a biased and factually incorrect far-right worldview, all of which I found to be undeniably true and beyond dispute. Now in that video, which I strongly recommend that you watch, Sean mentioned that there were a few PragerU courses, and by courses we mean YouTube videos, that were worthy of a more in-depth look. And so, since I imagine that Sean Senpai is a busy man and I can't quite wait until he decides to impart more of his wisdom upon us, I've decided to take a shot at one of PragerU's latest releases. A video titled What's the Deal with the Green New Deal, currently with about 400,000 views. Now, before I start, I care to mention that I am not a USA citizen, I do not live in the USA, and that I have little to no interest in American political discourse. As years have passed, I have found that keeping up with American politics has a way of turning into a frustrating full-time affair. I do, however, manifest a large degree of intolerance for all manner of dubious thinking, and I found this video to be a particularly egregious piece of corporate propaganda. So, all preambles aside, let's get into it.
We face an existential threat. Life as we know it is on the line. We have 12 short years to change everything, or it's game over. This is the terrifying scenario that's used by many leading politicians to justify a Green New Deal.
Enter our narrator, Alex Epstein, who is a philosopher with no scientific background, author of The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, former fellow of the Ayn Rand Institute, and founder of the Center for Industrial Progress, a for-profit think tank known to have received conspicuous funding from the Koch brothers. It is particularly notable that in 2016, Mr. Epstein's Center for Industrial Progress was named in a Massachusetts subpoena looking for communications between ExxonMobil and organizations denying climate change. Having established the absolute absence of possible conflict of interest, let us continue.
An unprecedented increase in government power focused on the energy industry.
Unprecedented, huh? One wonders, is Mr. Epstein really that ignorant, or does he just rely on his audience to not know about the New Deal? Who knows? Go figure.
The core idea of a Green New Deal is that government should rapidly prohibit the use of fossil fuel energy and impose 100% renewable energy, mostly solar and wind.
Alright, so we'll have to stop it again. Didn't take long, huh? See, this is a lie as well as a tried scaremongering tactic. Notice the wording. Government, rapidly, prohibit, impose. The libs are trying to change things. Scary. Now, let's replace a few of those words. The government should rapidly substitute the use of fossil fuel energy and incentivize 100% renewable energy. There we go. Sounds a lot less scary now, doesn't it? Unless you're in the fossil fuel business, or in some oil baron's pocket for that matter.
Today, 80% of the energy Americans use to heat their homes, farm their land, run their factories, and drive their cars comes from fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas. Only 3.4% comes from solar and wind, despite decades of government subsidies and mandates to encourage their use.
For reference, in 2016, the United States subsidized solar and wind power for a total of approximately $5 billion. So on the face of it, this is true. But I'd say that it's worth mentioning that the US oil, coal, and gas industries are also heavily subsidized. Studies have found that in the year 2016 alone, the USA subsidized fossil fuels to the tune of anything between $20 and $600 billion. According to who you ask and how much of the environmental damage is accounted for. It's easy to understand why the US energy market is so heavily swayed towards fossil fuels once you come to know that its costs are greatly amortized by the taxpayer.
The reason we don't use much sunlight and wind as energy is that they are unreliable fuels that only work when the sun shines and the wind blows.
I must admit that I am in awe at this man's face. I had yet to witness a shit-eating grin of this caliber. This man is giving you the facts, and damn, he is smug about it. Only, is he giving you the facts? Are wind and sunlight constant sources of power? No, as things are, they aren't. The somewhat sporadic nature of sunshine and wind does indeed present enormous difficulties, whereas other forms of energy production can be employed on demand. Solar and eolic power can only be used when available, and in the absence of energy storage solutions must be complemented by other sources. This is indeed one of the greatest challenges that humanity must face in the pursuit of 100% renewable energy. However, it does not diminish the benefits of pursuing such a goal. Across October of 2018, Scotland was able to meet 98% of its domestic power demand through its eolic plants, and in 2019, between January and June, those same eolic plants produced enough energy to power 4.4 million households, twice the number of all households in Scotland, to the point that the UK could afford to shut down its coal plants for up to 18 days in a row, an instance which had not occurred since 1882. At the time of writing, the United Kingdom is once again on a 6-day stint of coal-free energy generation, in no small part due to the heavy contribution of its state-subsidized wind power. And while the UK still relies on natural gas to meet a large portion of its energy demand, it's easy to see how state-led development of renewable resources has a real, tangible effect. And although I do not think that humanity is likely to achieve complete independence from fossils within our lifetimes, there are demonstrable benefits to investments in renewables. Now, I find it quite hilarious that, nowhere in this video does our narrator mention hydroelectric and geothermal energy, presumably because their efficacy as reliable sources of power has long been proven. Indeed, among the countries which have achieved near total independence from fossil fuels, most rely heavily on hydro dams and geothermal plants.
That's why no town, city, or country has ever come close to 100% or even 50% solar and wind.
And yet again, how convenient to exclude hydroelectric and geothermal power out of this argument. You see, if he didn't, he might have to mention that the likes of Iceland, Paraguay and Albania get all of their energy out of renewables. Still, this is true. Wind and solar power only cover a fairly small percentage of the world's energy needs. However, these are young, undeveloped industries, which is precisely why they could greatly benefit from government investment programs. As an example, the total US wind power production increased tenfold between the years of 2007 and 2017, despite the 2008 recession which slowed down economic development for much of the early 2010s. By this thinking, a 19th century man could argue that electricity never had a future, seeing as Americans still lit their homes with gaslight and candles for 50 years after Edison first brought electric light to Manhattan. As the president and founder of the Center for Industrial Progress, Mr. Alex Epstein should be well aware that industrial progress takes time.
All of this is justified by the need to do something about the existential threat of rising CO2 levels.
No, Mr. Epstein. All of this is justified by decade after decade of accurate climate change predictions, some commissioned by organizations as trustworthy as the American Petroleum Institute, which has been aware of the lasting impact of fossil fuel use since the late 60s.
We're told on a daily basis that prestigious organizations like the United Nations have predicted mass destruction and death if we don't get off fossil fuels. What we're not told is that such predictions have a decades-long track record of getting it wrong. And by wrong, I mean completely missing the dartboard wrong. For example, in 1989, the Associated Press reported a United Nations prediction that entire nations could be wiped off the face of the Earth by rising sea levels if the global warming trend is not reversed by the year 2000. We're now 2 decades past 2000. We're not missing any nations.
Oh boy, this might surprise you, but I am not a native English speaker. And this is where I have to put myself in the rather awkward position of teaching a native English speaker how to interpret words written in his own language. It takes a minimum of reading comprehension to understand that the author of the aforementioned article means to say that it is the trend that must be reversed by the year 2000, not the nations that will be wiped off by that year. But you don't have to trust my word. The article itself says as much, and it is still available online. I have linked it in the description below. You'd think that our friend Alex would have read it, but no, he was content with quoting a paragraph which only conforms to his argument when read by someone who can't read.
But aren't things bound to get worse? Haven't scientists established that CO2 is a greenhouse gas with a warming influence on the planet?
Let's take it from the man himself.
Yes.
Thank you. Much appreciated.
But that's only a small part of the big picture. Although CO2 causes some warming, it's much less significant than we've been told. Since we started using significant amounts of fossil fuels in the middle of the 19th century, we've increased the percentage of CO2 in the atmosphere from 0.03% to 0.04%, which correlates with an average temperature increase of about 2 degrees Fahrenheit. It also correlates with significant global greening, because CO2 is plant food.
So, what is this? Alex admits that increased CO2 levels correlate to an increase in global temperatures, and in turn, he correlates this to global greening as a justification. Now, this is a particularly insidious argument, and it is the single reason why I felt it necessary to make this video. Because global greening is an actual observable phenomenon which has been occurring for the past few decades, and it is indeed largely caused by the rising levels of CO2. Notice rising because despite a steady increase in plant biomass across the globe, the totality of Earth's plant life still cannot cope with the quantities of greenhouse gases we emit. Regardless, more greenery is good, right? It makes sense. So, is global greening a beneficial phenomenon? Well, not according to the EPA, which warns about the dangers of eutrophication, a phenomenon caused by the excessive richness of nutrients in bodies of water. As carbon dioxide becomes more abundant in the atmosphere, so too it becomes more abundant in water, where when combined with fertilizer runoff and increasing water temperature levels, it produces algae blooms. When algae blooms die, the bacteria that decompose the algae also deplete oxygen in the water. Without oxygen, fish and other animals suffocate. And all of this results in production of methane, a powerful greenhouse gas. As it turns out, global greening damages water ecosystems, decreases the availability of clean drinking water, endangers fishing industries across the globe, and further accelerates the process of global warming.
All of this is far from unprecedented territory for our planet, which has existed with at least 10 times today's CO2 levels and a 25-degree warmer average temperature.
Now this is a truly stunning piece of work. You just can't make this up. Because yet again, he is technically right. Our planet has indeed seen such conditions. Back in the Cambrian period, 500 million years ago, in a time when the dominant life forms on Earth were arthropods. So, you take that as you will. Anyway, according to 2019 measurements, the level of atmospheric CO2 on Earth has reached 400 parts per million, the highest it's been in 800,000 years. For all those out of the loop, our species, Homo sapiens, has existed for less than half of that. But he is still right. Our planet has seen it all. And I reckon it'll be fine, even without us. He then goes on to tell us that humanity is living an age of unprecedented prosperity and that access to fossil fuel is closely linked with well-being. And although I feel like a better writer could write a whole dissertation about the problems with these 2 paragraphs here, I'll just try to give you the short version. Yes, fossil fuels have enabled human development. The question at hand isn't whether fossil fuels are useful, but whether continued use is sustainable, and whether mankind is ready to deal with its consequences. And in light of the overwhelming scientific consensus, the scale of our collective fossil fuel addiction is a danger to humanity, which is why initiatives like the Green New Deal aim to reduce our reliance on carbon-heavy energy in favor of more sustainable energy sources. We've used the stuff so far, and it has worked, for better or worse. This is no excuse to stop innovating. The sled worked alright until we invented the wheel, and the horse worked alright until we invented the car. Incremental development is the key to human success, and in light of the challenges of our time, it appears necessary that we reconsider the status quo.
The most promising form of alternative energy is not unreliable solar and wind, but reliable carbon-free nuclear energy. Sweden gets 40% of its electricity from nuclear, France over 70%. While nuclear energy is smeared as unsafe, it has actually been demonstrated by study after study to be the safest form of energy ever created. And yet, Green New Deal proponents, who say that we have 12 years to save the planet from rising CO2 levels, vigorously oppose nuclear, in addition to all fossil fuel use.
As it happens, Sweden also gets 40% of its electricity from hydroelectric power, a renewable resource, in addition to a 10% from wind and only a grand total of 2% from fossil fuels. Not to mention that the French nuclear industry is entirely owned by the French government, and I wonder how that fits within the PragerU narrative. But he is right. Nuclear energy is indeed very safe, topping even renewables such as wind and solar. And I too think that it's worth having a conversation about the public's opinion of nuclear power. But it's funny that he fails to mention fossil fuels here, because as it turns out, coal, oil and natural gas account for 99% of deaths caused by energy production. So much for the safety concerns.
By opposing every affordable, abundant, reliable form of energy, the Green New Deal won't protect us from an existential threat. It is an existential threat.
And isn't it funny how this video starts by accusing scientists and politicians of scaremongering and ends with the words existential threat? The irony knows no bounds. I really do wonder what interests do Alex Epstein and PragerU serve. Who knows? Now, I'd like to close out this video with a smart, witty line, but on the assumption that 90% of you already tuned out 10 minutes ago, I'll just recommend that you check out a video called How Does the Power Grid Work by Practical Engineering for a quick intro into the difficulties of power distribution. It's fascinating stuff. Also, I'll apologize to Sean for stealing whole bits of his scripts. Let's call it a homage, shall we? And on an ending note, allow me to tell you that I'm not Russian, and that I look forward to any comments accusing me of being Russian.